the times we have gotten to connect, I have a few concrete
Definitely.
memories with you of really meaningful conversations for me. And I love the work that you and the Lyft folks, there was the loop there. I love the work that you and the other members of Lyft Economy are always doing. And I think without beating around the bush too much, I'm also very keen to talk to members of my community who are people of color, I'm especially interested in talking to Black men at this moment. And yeah, I just feel like there's this, there's been this building for so long, and right now we're at kind of a fever pitch of many different intersections. One of them being, a lot of people standing up and saying we don't want to take police brutality anymore. But I have the sense that that's a stand-in for a much bigger conversation, really, that's moving. And yeah, and I feel like your work, your vocation is right in the middle of all of this, around a new form of economics, new form of governance, new form of earth-centered relationships. And yeah, man, I just want to talk. I want to get your perspective on it and swap some ideas, and yeah, and just hopefully bring your voice out to our audience. And as always, my podcast is really centered on kind of authentic long form conversation. So I don't, it doesn't need to be like what I really love to do and what I want to do is get out into the creative edge where maybe there's thoughts that haven't been thought before, or maybe I love it when I'm like, oh man, I didn't even think about that, or sometimes guests get into that place as well. So that's kind of the context, man. That's where we're at. Just present moment. What the hell's up? What's alive? And what are we all going to do about it?
Yeah. Yep. That's the question of the hour.
So maybe it's just worthwhile, Andrew, to just give a brief, hey, this is who I am to the listeners out there.
Sure.
Just kind of start there, and then we can wander our way into the juicy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I give a little bit of a introduction to myself. Thank you. Appreciate everything that you just shared, and looking forward to diving into all of that with you. So hello, everyone tuning in. Thanks for tuning in to Gregory's show. It's a great show. Grateful to be on. And yeah, my name is Andrew Baskin, and I'm a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy. And Lyft is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. And there's many things that we explore under that umbrella. Myself, my background is, I guess I approached this work really just based on analogous principles, you might say, of harmony or balance or healing or love. And early in my journey, that started off with audio engineering, music theory, literal harmony, and have subsequently moved on to studying regenerative agriculture and food systems, and then applying those principles in the economic dimension and hopping around, because we can't take a sort of myopic approach. We need to take that systems approach. And I'm approaching all of that really from on the theme of some of the things you queued up, from a liberatory place. Liberatory is maybe synonymous with all of those things that I mentioned a moment ago.
Say more about liberatory and what you how does that live for you, and what as a frame?
Yeah. I mean, there's how does that live for me, and how does that live for each of us? And I guess I want to just qualify off the bat, like this is Andrew Baskin's perspective on all of this and stuff. I don't want anyone to necessarily fall in the trap of like, this is a Black man speaking on that, or however. But yeah, so I mean, we live in the trap, right? So many traps, and in order to live in the context in which we live, we all have to be functionally miseducated to live within the context in which we live. And so, we live in a context where, my ancestors, for example, and I have many, I mean, from many different cultures, from African American, Native American, European, was raised in a Jewish household, et cetera. So there's kind of a lot of blending happening. But particularly within the context of kind of a Black, Indigenous, people of color lens broadly, there's obviously, we know that there's been ongoing oppression and some myths and things like this that keep it in place. And yeah, it's difficult to kind of like concisely describe the scope of it, but essentially it's like there's that dimension of things, and then there's like the dimension of the liberation and getting power for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and there's also all of us within this scheme of imperial conquest, monopoly, capitalism, wealth consolidation, ultimately ways of being in extractive relationship versus the other end, which is the coming together, which is the regenerative and liberatory. So there's layers to that kind of liberatory lens. But yeah, I realize I'm maybe being a bit abstract, but specifically like livelihoods, particularly right livelihoods. Like it's not just having access to an income, but something that actually enables us to express our unique individual humanity. This country has never been a democracy. It's maybe been a political representative democracy, but we've never had economic democracy, and that's huge. The institutions that we're working with, that if we look upstream, a leverage point that I've found helpful is, I go into this process a lot I call it, causation hunting, or, looking at dependency chains. And, if, like with the farm, for example, if you go as far upstream in the system as possible, then like from like the plate, and then either, people will throw it in the trash or put it in the compost, go upstream in that system. Sometimes that's a very long relationship, but ultimately it comes to the farmer, right? And the land and the growing and that thing. And so that's a hugely powerful place within the food system, from the soil and the farmer on through that whole entire economy, which I would argue agriculture and food systems is the foundation of any economy. But similarly, within the economic context, there's, the enterprise is sort of the ability, it's sort of like the farmer of the economic landscape, leveraging the seed value proposition to, within the soil, which is the business that surrounds it, to create, capital or value that gets distributed throughout the system downstream. And so part of that liberatory lens is like looking at, like with, David and Goliath, I have limited capacity and I have to like try and aim my stone well, trying to look at leverage points as far upstream in the system as possible in order to kind of trickle out is part of how I think about that. And maybe that brings in some of the like effectiveness and strategy side of that, but that's
so that upstream, like moving upstream in the watershed image, as you were saying that, I had the image of that great sort of corny movie, The Upward Spiral, with that Paul Crefel produced. You ever seen that?
No, I'm not familiar.
Oh, well, it's in which case I apologize for a tangent, but it's really interesting. At some point I'll have to send it to you. It's like this self-produced, this really sort of like soft-spoken, sweet Quaker guy did this self-produced video over the course of a year, in which it's sort of like him talking about moving up the watershed in order to be effective. And it's all these images of like the rushing water eroding banks downstream.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's images of him seemingly nowhere close. You know, he's like a mile away or whatever, up the watershed with a hand trowel. And he's got this little hand trowel, and with a hand trowel, he's going where the rivulets start to concentrate and they start rushing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just sort of like making these little trowel swales.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts at the top and he goes all the way down. And by the time he gets down over the course of a year, that cut in the bank, that rushing torrent is no longer there. It's a trickle. It's still pouring rain, but it's this trickle, and it's this watershed regeneration metaphor that you were just inviting us into, and just sort of like understanding how to engage as individuals or communities with this sort of, sometimes confusing superstructure of an economy where maybe it feels like we're getting put into boxes, or we're getting forced into situations, or we're being oppressed, or we're oppressing in ways that don't, that aren't connected with our necessarily agency. And what I was taking from your share there was just a reminder of, each of us is actually capable. Maybe this is kind of like my definition of free will in a way. Each of us is capable of taking a moment to look around and then moving up in our metaphorical watershed, and just like going up a little bit, and whatever tool we have, just start doing something. And I don't know, does that resonate with you use the word right livelihood? Does that kind of resonate and intersect with what you're calling out there and sort of have in mind?
Yeah, well, I think the right livelihood side of things is that in the context that I'm using it, and maybe just to quickly affirm, yes, the analogy, the metaphor that you gave is spot on. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Can you?
Right livelihood is what I was asking about.
Thanks. Yeah, so that's kind of part of the psychology. There's like traps on so many levels, right? Like ecological or economic traps, psychological traps, etc. And there's like a psychology that we can easily fall into.
When you say trap, just to get sort of like some of our language.
Yeah.
When you say trap, are you referring to sort of like social patterns, like maybe personal habits, sort of the general superstructure of our society and economy that just sort of like pull us in ways that maybe are dehumanizing or environmentally degenerative? Am I getting what you're laying down there as far as like your mental model of what a trap is?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I'm thinking about a trap, I'm thinking about something that keeps us stuck. Yeah. Or that may, there's many kinds and types of traps, but it's something that we get stuck in a situation that is not beneficial.
Yeah.
And it can be, just like, if you're going into entrepreneurship, there's maybe some like pitfalls and traps and things like that to avoid. and part of the like psychology of, I think, living in the economic culture that we live in is the relationship to work for many of us is like really just revenue generation, right? So
Yeah.
and it, if we kind of like dial back what I was mentioning earlier around like well, I don't want to I don't want to lose anyone by jumping around too much.
Don't worry about it. I mean, this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is a conversation between the two of us that
Okay.
other people get to listen to, and if they're stoked on it as we go deeper and deeper, that's sort of the art form, right? It's like, don't worry about
right.
it. Go where your mind wants to go.
Word. Well, for me, so much of all of this whole conversation of, you know, sustainability and regeneration and all of these things, like distilling it down is like all of it, all, and maybe some will take this as an oversimplification, but for me, it is 100% about shifting from being an extractive relationship, either parasitic or predatory, to being in mutually beneficial relationship, or at the very least, you know, someone benefits and the other is neutral. There's kind of like in symbiosis, right? There's like a economic symbiosis. You know, we have the ecological behavior, and we call that symbiosis, and those same principles apply in economic context, and that intersects with, you know, with ecology, right? And how we are extracting from the land. So it's not about you know, mining the soil, but it's about actually regenerating and, you know, working with those systems. And so it's that, bringing it back to that, it's about the relationship that's there, and what is the nature of that relationship. And that kind of mentality also comes into how we approach our work, right? Or how we approach ourselves in our work versus kind of, I don't know if I want to like embellish this point too much, but, you know, just feeling inspired, feeling pulled to do work that both, you know, that mainly that you feel called to do, regardless of whether you're good or not at it. But, you know, maybe mainly that you feel called to do and that's needed.
It's funny that you say called, you know, like the etymology of vocation, that voca is like, that's call. It's that's the, you know, Latin for to, like a calling, literally. So it's interesting that you're going there. I'm curious
Before
to
you
sort of
jump,
bring this to.
I just
Go
wanted
ahead.
to say another little bit there, just to
Yep.
kind of tie it back, is that like how I'm relating to that personally is uh I feel like an aspect of the liberation that the ancestors that have come before me maybe have not had that choice, to be able, they have had to prioritize decisions that created economic financial security for them and their family in order to survive. And there's a very close tie-in with that and some of the, you know, oppression that's been going on for a long time. So hopefully
So
that.
that's, it's sort of like what you're honing in on there, to see if I can, you know, like anchor in my sense making here, the pivotal role of what I was sort of referring to as vocation, or the the ability to, the ableness to follow one's own calling is somehow fundamental to, like in different people, in different ways. um that's been taken from a lot of people historically and in the present moment.
Right.
And in a real way, I think on the optimistic side, which is how you've been framing everything, of like, it's like, this is what you want. It's sort of like the, like what you're serving, what you're trying to, is what I'm getting, is like liberatory to you means freeing up people's ableness to follow their calling, basically.
Yeah. I think it can be fun to approach someone you know or a random stranger and ask the question, if money was no object, what would you do with your time
Yeah.
today for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years? What would that be? And, you know, maybe link that with like a deathbed reflection of like looking back, how would you want to spend those days? And I think that probably the answer to that is not necessarily how most of us are living our lives. And that
Or day
is
to
the
day, yeah.
trap in motion, right? We're swimming in the water.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's such a powerful question. And, you know, so then where my mind goes, you know, and we don't need to steer the conversation in this direction if you don't want to, but it's very up for me, it's very present for me. It is really around, you know, in general, maybe even, I don't even think this needs to be a race issue, to be honest. I mean, I think it's important to be able to analyze it from a variety of different perspectives, including race, but probably doesn't even need to be. We could just sort of say, what's the responsibility of those who have been liberated, or were born liberated, or have enough space in whatever way we want to talk about it, to be following their calling? What's the responsibility of those people to people who are stuck, whether it's mentally stuck or whether it's oppressed in a variety of different ways, unconsciously or consciously by a system? What's the line of relationship and responsibility in this paradigm that you're expressing between?
Totally. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think so when it comes to that, where um, there's two things that come to mind with that. The first is a saying that something that is, you know, something that value that I was raised with, lift as we climb is the saying. And the other part is decompartmentalizing. And that so in response to your question, the like part of the psychology that we have been in for so long is very compartmentalized. We're able to separate out these different things, and some of that compartmentalization is starting to break down. And that has implications for how we approach our work. That has implications for our relationships with those around us who may or may not be similarly situated in, you know, any number of intersectional ways. But you know, especially as this global pandemic is made very plain, how deeply interconnected we are, we have to sort of confront some of this compartmentalization that we've done, which includes compartmentalizing people into certain areas that receive greater, you know, pollution and a variety of burdens, or, you know, in cages or whatever. And in terms of the responsibility, accountability side of that, it's like, how can we center, you know, historically marginalized groups, under-resourced groups in the work? How can we do that? There's kind of a whole philosophical theory of change that informs that type of approach.
Who do you find inspiring in that arena that's doing work that you find really
Yeah,
invigorating, inspiring, alive?
sure. Yeah. So many folks that we've featured on the Next Economy Now podcast.
Yeah.
One of them is a guy by the name of Dennis Derrick, who runs an organization called the Corbin Hill Food Project in New York. And they completely changed the game and the food system in New York, particularly for people of color, but also building economic relationships between many rural farmers, most of whom are not people of color, and the boroughs of New York, and being able to provide pretty bespoke delivery service to all of those communities where there was hitherto not access to a lot of these types of foods and culturally relevant foods and so on and so forth. That's maybe more on the like culture and access and the food system side of things. Jessica Norwood and the team with the Runway Project are working to help, Black and other POC entrepreneurs access the sort of quote unquote friends and family startup capital that enterprises who typically come from backgrounds with that fit a certain image. Like pulling back from that, it's like speaking to you from the regenerative agriculture side of things. It's like a lot of this is very, and this ties back to the decompartmentalizing, like we could as a regenerative agriculture practitioner, and you're approaching working in a desert, like or a place that is perceivably resource scarce in some dimension that limits its capacity to fully express itself. There's resources there, there's huge assets there, there's huge potential there, and part of it is helping to not underestimate that land and to reveal its potential.
Yeah.
And there's some like critical things that you can do. Like I might, start with some type of hugelkultur type operation in a desert, create a water battery, create something, and continue to build out from there. But the way that the folks kind of relate often to degraded land is in like versus fertile soil. That same kind of phenomenon happens in the economic space, where we just want to gravitate towards the people with resources, and services and product offerings and all that gravitate towards the people with resources. And the people without resources are sometimes left out of that equation. But how could you take that kind of same mentality that you would take as an ecological designer in a desert context with a ton of potential that's interconnected to all of the other land around it, and do that in a socioeconomic type of way? Is that making sense?
Totally. And what I love about that perspective is that it honors these dimensions of place and culture and non-monetary wealth, and it invites us to be creative and embrace the resources we do have and the resources that are available, and to use those as the base for, instead of just looking outside and like looking over at those other folks who we have our images of, and they live in a castle and floor to ceiling glass and whatever it is, right? And their culture is a certain way, and they listen to a certain type of music or whatever. If we look at ourselves wherever we may be, and that's always been something that I've marveled at, because I oftentimes feel as though there's a generalized trend, and you know, there's always exceptions to this, of course, but a generalized trend, in my opinion, that the further up the socioeconomic ladder one climbs, the more one trades real wealth and real connectedness as it's measured by relationship, reciprocity, cultural richness, all of these other things. There's like an inverse relationship oftentimes. It's not all the time. And I think there's some cool exceptions to that rule, actually. But a lot of times, that's my experience, even personally. Like the times that I optimize to be making money, and this is basically kind of going back to something you said earlier, which is people's relationship to making money, or rather, we should just say people's relationship to work is making money instead of vocation, instead of asking, how do I serve? What's the creative
Exactly.
thing that I can do with my community? What's actually here already?
That same principle actually apply, like that's at the individual level, and then at the enterprise level too. The way, like your typical C corporation, the way that it's structured, it's a money farm essentially. It's to make money versus like we're also, you know, shifting that paradigm to, okay, what is the actual like calling of this? Does this enterprise want to be that actually has meaning?
Yeah.
That's not, you know, extractive, that can build wealth in ways that are beneficial. If we become conscious of the choice that we're in relationship in ways that are parasitic or predatory or win-lose, we can make the conscious choice to shift that to be in beneficial relationship. If we're not aware of that choice, then we're in the trap. And then, you
Right.
know, if we are aware of that choice, then we can be held accountable for the decisions that we make. You know, so I like to presence that. And, you know, if folks choose to be in relationship in that way and are not actively working to cease being in relationship in that way, there's consequences to that.
Yeah. 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 It's actually, I'd love to get your, um, you know, I'd love to talk shop for a moment
Sure.
about the process of a corporate body exploring its calling. What does that, you know, and I imagine it also likely there's some parallels into communities. You know, what does it look like for a group? Whether it's a corporate body or, you know, a co-op or, you know, a neighborhood, to work to explore calling together. And yeah, I'd love to hear you riff on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, you know, I'm probably, I can definitely riff on it. And I know that there's people who have tons of really rich experience on some of this stuff, from, you know, Diane Leaf Christensen's book on, you know, eco village organizing, to things around organizing co-ops, or just, you know, pulling together, you know, a team in general. But I think that there's different, maybe I want to, before I just kind of like launch into responding to that, I just want to clarify. Can you maybe restate the question, or reform it?
Yeah, there's something that you said that got me excited, and specifically, like, just to sort of like, you know, share some of my context. I was excited because in Carol Sanford's work and some of the work that I've done in the past around regenerative business, there's this concept of essentially of corporate vocation
Mhm.
and sort of essence, and similar, it's sort of similar language where you know, people are trying to sort of unveil what the founding impulse was of a business. Like, what's the meaning that this business is trying to bring to its customers? Not just like what value are you extracting from people, but how do you uniquely make your customers in the business context? How do you uniquely serve your customers in a way that that's evolving them, that's making them more able, increasing their ableness to express their essence and follow their vocation in some way, whatever the service is that you're doing. And so I kind of got excited that there felt like there's an intersection there. And I
Mhm.
know that that's very close to the work in some way that Lyft does with, um,
Yeah.
you know, convenings whether it's convenings of stakeholders to ask like, what do we want to do together, or working with businesses to help
Mhm.
people get deeper alignment. And so I'm just curious, you know, what experience you have, and yeah, just what's moving, what's alive right there from your
Sure.
perspective as a practitioner at Lyft that feels really invigorating. That was kind of where my mind was going.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think that is you could probably tell I have, my mind is kind of I'm an analogous thinker, but I think it's kind of like extrapolating from, we could take that question to ourselves as individuals, as an identity, right? And that may grow and shift over time. Like
Yeah.
sometimes we can be in the mentality of like, oh, I have to pick like what it's going to be, and like it's linear,
Uh-huh.
and that's probably a painful path to walk. But
Yeah.
holding space for balancing, like maybe setting some things in temporarily, and embracing that it's something that's iterative and may shift over time. I actually recently, this is kind of, so Lyft uses this framework that was our business design framework, is what we kind of, the flow that we go through in our Next Economy MBA. There's like a design layer, revenue layer, admin layer. Within the design layer, there's vision, culture, strategy, operations. And then what you're asking about is kind of within that scope of probably some mix of the vision and the culture, the culture having implication, there's a tight relationship between those spaces. But there's actually many, we could say like, let's create a vision for our enterprise. And I could say that, and it can mean 100 different things in many people's minds. So nuancing a little bit about what that is, it's like, and I just kind of started doing this somewhat recently, but teasing it out. So there's vision as, source of inspiration that conveys a sense of inspiration, passion, or purpose that carries the energy that pulls on us rather than, pushing ourselves. It's the one that helps to attract and retain people. And
Yeah.
there's things that organically emerge from a real desire and a real longing, and those are the ones that catalyze the most other people. They're super compelling, and when you see someone with like a real emotion like that, that authenticity is what people want to move toward and be a part of. And that's kind of like vision as inspiration. And then there's vision as values, principles, identity, or way of being. There's vision as your overarching objective, which I think is getting into the space that we're talking about, is like, is our overarching objective for monetary purpose or some other, thing? And I think that that's just like emergent. I think that's just a listening into the hearts of, who is present for that conversation, for that design process. Vision is organizing principle or cornerstone that's sort of like the primary reference point for the whole organization, and that helps to constrain decision making and inform enterprise design. So there's I don't know if it's maybe pulling one other part is like that, having some things around that help to create vision as a navigational device, as a compass. Is this at all remotely answering your question, or am I kind of just talking around it? I can't tell.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's some, I'm excited to just like get a glimpse of how you as an individual, but also as a representative of a community of practice, are thinking about some of these things. And, I sort of heard, as I was listening, I heard you describe 3 dimensions of vision that, I think, Matt, are meaningful discernments around, what drives will, and how does it show up in a being, expressed in a being way, culture, and these sorts of things, and how does it show up functionally, with how we design business objectives, and these sorts of things. And yeah, I mean, I think it's
Right.
it's pretty coherent. And yeah.
If I could just add a couple more things to that, just to kind of like tie it together,
Yeah.
what we were talking about a moment ago is like, you know, say like your typical C corporation with shareholders, with shareholder primacy, the function of the enterprise is essentially a money farm that maximizes, you know, wealth accumulation, consolidation for those, you know, quote unquote owners. And so contrasting that with, you know, that like contrasting a corporation that's part of the vision, as well as looking at sort of the system behavior, you know, that like the goal or the system, the way that it functions. And that also connects intimately with teasing out another part of vision, which is like, for like any for-profit enterprise, there's the needs fulfillment side. But, you know, there's many of us who are in the working for systems transformation and systems change. And that's a wholly different, you know, enterprise. And part of our task is making those things complementary. But those are sort of, you know, and sometimes there's overlap, right? But fulfilling needs that exist in, you know, whoever you're looking to serve is part of what makes that reinforcing feedback loop happen, where you're able to provide value and you receive financial reciprocity back in enough quantity that enables you to grow your capacity to deliver on that need, versus the greater and deeper need that you may be working to change conditions within the context in which you're nested in society, in a neighborhood, in a, you know, what have you. So just wanted to kind of tease that out a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. So there's in some way, there's the need to be able to identify sort of these nested systems where there's like an individual, there's a business, there's a neighborhood, there's an ecoregion. Would you say that at each of those levels, you know, there's some sort of vocation, you know?
Sure.
Like, yeah. So it's like a neighborhood kind of like we can sort of, we could invite ourselves to consider, you know, the vocation or purpose of a neighborhood. And we could invite ourselves to be, while also holding our own, like what's mine and how does that relate, you know, and a business is as well. Is that kind of how your mental model is working, referring that back to just trying to get this concept in how you're holding it around, you know, reciprocity and relationship, and anchoring what does it look like to be considering, you know, either win-win or, you know, win-neutral dynamics between people.
Yeah. I'm going to share another analogy.
Yeah, great.
So I think some of the ways in which I think about the economy is very informed by ecology. And so thinking of, you know, organizations sort of as economic organisms within a landscape, and that happens at multiple scales, right? We can go down to the ant making, you know, the little ant hill, and then, you know, the the larger, you know, predatory animals that are helping move herds across the landscape. There's different, you know, scales and niches to engage all over the place. But it's kind of being tuned into recognizing where there's a need to be filled, and that like, and people are doing, or excuse me, those, you know, like if I'm thinking about organisms, like there are organisms who are just in doing kind of needs fulfillment. They're meeting their own needs, and, you know, maybe having some kind of exchange with another organism in the process. And then there's also animals who are changing actively and intentionally changing the conditions around them to be more beneficial to themselves and others. Mycelium,
as
elephants.
Bill Mollison always said, everything gardens.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and shoot, there's another thing that I was going to say. Oh, maybe.
Sorry to interrupt you there.
No worries.
Well, yeah. So what you were talking about there was just the analogy of being able to hold an image of our economy and relate it to what we know about the living world. And what I love about that is, to me, that is, I mean, you've sort of been dancing around generally a topic that I would broadly refer to as game theory, basically. From a mathematical perspective, it's called game theory. That's where you're like exploring, like, is this a zero-sum game, or is this, is this a different type of game that isn't zero-sum at all? And looking out at, just to ground this for a second and get your take on it. So looking out at the natural world, I can see that a lion is behaving in a predatory way with a gazelle, right? But that because of the scale that takes place and the ecological context that they're in, that predatory behavior is a force for balance, and it's a force for regeneration, and it's different. So there's like, at a micro scale, there's kind of a zero-sum game between that lion and that gazelle. Like, one of them's going to win. Like, the gazelle's going to get away and the lion's going to be hungry, or the lion's going to eat the gazelle.
It might be, or it might not be, though.
Yeah.
Like, I think I love that question, like that. And anyone who's asking that question is, they're thinking about it, right? But like for most of us, it's like, it's not even really at that point. Like,
well, tell me the scenario in which just like the relationship between the lion and the gazelle, in which you're like, well, is that actually zero sum? I want to hear that. That's where.
Sure. Right. Well, I think that requires some, like, if I'm sitting right there, right, and I see the flesh being ripped from this gazelle, and it's like, I can, potentially empathize with the gazelle, or if I see this, lion feeding its family and all of that, I can empathize with the lion. And like, what's the space for me empathizing with both? And they're providing many ecological functions. If one has insight into, has been patient enough to observe long enough, or to take the time to like learn about some of those systems, that those predator animals are helping to keep a certain level of balance, and not necessarily from a place of intentionality, but functionally keeping and who knows, maybe they are being intentional. I don't want to necessarily denigrate the potential intelligence of a hypothetical lion, but moving them across a plain, or the feeding place, enables the grasses to regenerate, the soil to regenerate, and so on and so forth. That helps to keep the population in check, so that again, the plant life is not, the carrying capacity of the space that the whole scenario exists within is not overly taxed. There's the like individual interaction level, and then there's the fact that it's nested within this larger system.
Well, so yeah, I mean, exactly.
It can get nuanced and complicated, like, very quickly, but yeah.
But exactly. I mean, that's what's so fascinating to me, is what, like, in what moments is competition between an individual or a company, for instance, create like non-linear scaling regeneration, because the relationship between that, like, depending, exactly as you said, like, depending on your subjective view, like, are you inside the gazelle running, or are you the lion, or are you zooming out and watching what takes place, or are you looking at the nutrient cycle and the herd movement and the seasons and the larger ecosystem balance? And the fact, I think it's a fact, and this is kind of what's exciting to me, I think it's a fact that at different scales these relationships have to follow different rules. And that I think one of the ways to talk about what's happened in our society, and sort of like in an attempt to make some meaning that doesn't personalize the oppressive structures and allows people to step back and see themselves in it and see other people in it, and then have some agency around what we actually want to do together, is something like the understanding that, I don't know how, just to put it in a simple way, that it's like mistaken readings of Darwinism created this weird social Darwinism, which basically used the analogy of a lion and a gazelle at the highest possible social scale. so that the whole system itself was competing, in essence, the way a predator does, instead of at the highest scale looking at the ecosystem and then understanding that there are places for predator-prey relationships, if you're using that analogy, but you don't scale that single relationship out to the like macrocosm of the world. That's kind of like crazy, and it creates all sorts of crazy things.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also different, levels of system balance, right? I think we might generally look at like, like a tropical rainforest as one of the most productive expressions of like living life in an ecology. But there's also, conditions where that is not necessarily able to express as fully.
Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe a little bit of a subjective, intuitive kind of space.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think we, if we're used to, sometimes I get carried away with these analogies. I better stop. Yeah.
Well,
we can get used to swimming in the water that we're in.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the big challenge right now, I think. And I mean, to sort of like reground this conversation in the present moment, the very uncomfortable present moment, or maybe like super, I don't know, I got to be honest, I sort of oscillate between, man, I'm kind of all over the place with how I feel about what's going on right now on multiple levels. Global weirding feels like it's at an all-time peak, and I think it's going to keep getting weirder before it like starts subsiding. That's my sense of things. But
I think you should have a global weirding tea with your face on it.
That's an interesting meme. Maybe I should call this the Global Weirding Podcast.
I think so. I think it would be good marketing.
It's better. It's better marketing for sure than the Planetary Regeneration Podcast. Who wants to say that? No. Okay, it's done. I'm changing it to the Global Weirding Podcast. Awesome. Yeah, nice. Peak global weirding. I mean, it's been funny. I mean, are you comfortable shifting gears a little bit?
Yeah, man. Let's come out of the clouds.
So yeah, see if we can't land. Well, I think it's been good to sort of like do this, shared meaning making back and forth, and let's see what we can't, if we can make those clouds rain and, come down to earth. Mm-hmm. I'm finding myself all over the place emotionally with what's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement right now. I got to be honest. I'm all over the place. Sometimes I'm like almost elated, and I'm like, finally, seems like there's a critical mass of people who are like not going to take this shit anymore, and it seems like there's some amount of coherence here that actually could be transformative. And then other times I'm like confused, frustrated, scared, angry,
Yeah.
you know, and I imagine that kind of like everybody's going through a similar kaleidoscope of emotions right now. I doubt I'm the only one. And my guess is everybody's got their different triggers. You know, like the things that make me angry are maybe not the same things that make you angry, or maybe they are, but you know, just there's going to be differences. And yeah, I don't know. I'm really sitting with how, well, I mean, just to get to the point here. So I've been sitting with this question about how I engage the most productively with this conversation. It, when my read on it is probably the most productive thing, that many people's opinion, and it may be absolutely right, that the most productive thing I can do is shut up and listen. That's like, and just like holding that and like wondering, like, is that true? Is it always true? How do I calibrate my like receptors to modulate my interactions so that I'm creating the right amount of space to listen and learn, while also not like tuning out? Because the risk there is to just sort of like kind of like drift off and become alienated from it and be like, well, this is other people's stuff because I don't really have a voice here. And somehow that I'm projecting like crazy here, but I sort of feel like my struggle, I have a sense that that struggle of like, how do I productively participate? How do I build relationships here that are meaningful? We may be on different, people may be on different sides of the coin on this, but that is somehow the crux of the question that we're struggling with as a society somehow. Is like, how do we actually build healthy relationships where, you know, where we're listening or acting appropriately and not just the way that we're habituated to do it, not just the way
So
we've always done it. So
I'll hit the pause. So replace, in that last sentence that you shared, replace the word healthy relationships with soil, and let's take it to the ecological. So like, how it's like, there's like, say there's a, if I replace the, you know, word soil in that sentence, it's kind of like the mindset of a farmer shifting from wanting to cultivate those types of relationships in the soil and in the farm versus the way that it's kind of conventionally done. And then, you know, from the permaculture kind of perspective, it's like the long protracted observation has its value when we're operating in, you know, a complex dimension where there's great uncertainty and unpredictability. And then we can kind of shift things and engage from that place. But, you know, I think that I don't think that there's necessary, I'm sure, you know, the answer to your question is it's very context specific, very
yeah,
context dependent. And like, I hear in your question, like, how, like maybe inquiring to some degree, or like sharing your inquiry into, you know, like how to gauge, you know, what to do when. I don't know if I necessarily have a clean and clear response to that, but I think that erring on the side of thought, like actively kind of listening and or asking questions, can be super helpful. But again, you know, it's not like you do, as everyone does, has a ton to, you know, contribute. So I don't think that it's about, you know, stifling that necessarily, but
yeah, it's funny that, you know, just to speak more directly to this, I mean, there's multiple levels. First, thank you for grounding back in the ecological metaphor, and you know, it's really powerful how that contextualization. I just resonate with that. I mean, I think if we're all able to think about the soil that we're trying to cultivate together, grow together, it's such a transformative frame. You know, our society is soil, and, you know, what emerges out of that, the fruits of our society can only grow from healthy soil. And that reframe is just super powerful. And I think it's a good North Star, and it's really powerful for me. And that's because I share a common sort of like background and language with you. So it sort of just like shifted me right there. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, seeing if we can like use that frame on some specific, you know, maybe controversial or edgy things. You know, I've been finding that recently I've been really turned off by the like academic. I've been really turned off by cancel culture. Super turned off by it. I'm like,
what culture? Sorry.
Cancel culture. The cancel culture. Yeah, the like deplatforming, or like what I perceive, and to me it feels like really interconnected somewhere at the very root of the like the new left. And Black Lives Matter is a part of this, but there's also it's multidimensional. It's a big movement. There's no single. There's a lot of humans involved. It's complex. I don't want to get sucked into.
I'm still not totally clear on what you're meaning by cancel culture.
Well, this sort of like,
help me to understand.
Cancel culture, and it may be, my perception is it's very active and it's very active in San Francisco and New York. It's very, there were several instances in which, you know, sort of like, in quotes, like right-wing thinkers or whatever got protested and then like kicked out of Berkeley, for instance. That happened like several times. And there's just sort of like this whole thing, like if you say something or you're a particular person, like you can't talk, and there's all this stuff happening in social media, and people are, whatever it is, like in quotes, doxing people. Anyway, there's this whole like, it feels like an information war, and it feels like it's like no holds barred, and there's this whole, it feels like dampening effect on good discourse. And I'm just trying to orient myself, because that to me feels like there's something super toxic there, which maybe I'm just trying to like calibrate my, you know, because we all live in our echo chambers. We you know, listen to this podcast or you read that person. I try to, I'll shut up in just a second. I've been doing my best, which is crazy making, but maybe useful, to do things like I listen to some really amazing far left podcasts, and I listen to some like really crazy right podcasts, and I like every once in a while I listen to MSNBC, and every once in a while I listen to Tucker Carlson on Fox, and I try to do this, and it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. It kind of makes me crazy, but I do my best to like listen to these, like this wide variety of different things. And the thing that I notice on the right wing of the spectrum, which is sort of like reactive, maybe verging towards ethno-nationalist, kind of scary and weird, but the thing that I resonate with, which they're like banging, is like pointing out these examples of the cancel culture that the left has going on. Then there's all these things on the left that I resonate with, but I see in the discourse, I hear, even on the podcast I listen to, it's like the air they breathe and the water they swim in, but they are living in the cancel culture. It's like an accurate call out that's taking place, I think. And I've been really just sitting with that and struggling. And I'm, you know, in every conversation I've had in the last month or so on this podcast, I've tried to get people's take on this subject. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are. And maybe I haven't done a good enough job of like rooting it in an experience that you even like, you know, have an opinion about. I don't know.
I'm reaching. I'm trying to. What is cancel culture? Like,
cancel culture is sort of like the idea that in order to create a safe space for everyone to to communicate, there are certain things that you can never say. And if somebody says it, they have to be like removed. That's the epitome. It's around the safe space concept. And there's good points to that, but the way it shows up is like, it's like censorship essentially is the way it shows up. And I think it's contextual. I mean, I think there's certain circumstances where you want to like create the boundaries, and there's other circumstances you don't. And mostly I think there's a productive conversation to have there, but I don't feel like that's what's happening. I feel like there's like a universalization of safe spaceness that is at least feared or experienced. That is my primary hangup as like a, sometimes radical, sometimes middle of the road, like sometimes progressive, sometimes, liberal, like white dude. That's my main hangup right now, politically, is the safe space conversation. It's like cancel culture, censorship, freedom of speech, and how I perceive that playing out. That's got me feeling very, yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that's landing still, and if it's not, we can just totally change subject. I don't need to keep. It's not really about me. I mean, it's about me insofar as I'm trying to get something from you, but
yeah. I'll try to meet you. Can you hit me with a question, and I'll try and share, because I'm not in the space that, like you said, you've been taking in all this media and stuff, so I'm not really in your head with the question that you're holding around it. But I could share what's coming up for me, but I'm just curious to kind of.
Well, first share what's coming up, and then let's calibrate, and I'll see if I can ask a more concrete question.
Well, what's coming up for me is, like, I think, to just put it plainly, or just to like say it kind of candidly or frankly, is like, yeah. I don't want to overcomplicate and obfuscate the root of the issues, and focus on kind of the symptoms. I think it goes again to that trowel kind of thing. There's that trowel analogy and the upriver thing that you talked about earlier. There's all kinds of plurality of confusion and chaos and malignment and dissonance can occur downstream from some inharmonious condition that something exists within. And so I could like get in the fray of looking at the sort of level of interactions right now, and I have to look at the system in like a larger span of time and see like the root issue that a lot of those things are surfacing.
Yeah.
And there's a secondary issue that's on top of that like a more cynical mind frame might refer to as like champagne problems, but that's like, there's a secondary problem, which is like, there's then, because of the backlash or response to some type of unjust condition, there is either like justified action or collateral damage or what have you in the mix of that. But it's like similar to like our immune response to COVID, right? Like nobody dies from the virus itself.
Totally. We die by the overreaction to the virus
of our immune response, right? Yeah. But the issue is not the root issue. There is not the overreaction of our immune response. It's the fact that we've been invaded by a virus that's producing this response. You know what I mean? So even within ourselves, with our integral body within ourselves, like we can get in a twist. But if we remove the virus and or have the ability to metabolize the virus through through our immune system, then we keep our focus on well-being and like the healing, the regeneration, the harmonizing, and that could be in the economic dimension, wealth distribution, or wealth. And like I say the wealth, I mean, I'm not talking about just money like land or wealth redistribution. I'm talking about in the social dimension. These things happen at many levels, like personal, structural, systemic. But like, rather than getting into the fray and the nuance of like this, I realize that there, I'm sure that there's a valuable context to analyze some of these things. And also, like, part where my mind gravitates towards is like, yeah, but the water that we're swimming in is all still kind of fucked, right? Like we're all breathing in this kind of like polluted context, and some of us are responding in different ways to it. Some, like, the polluted context is really working for some folks, even though on like a human or spiritual level it's probably really not.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what's kind of coming up for me in response. I don't like.
No, it's super useful, and I think the to take it another spiral, I would just say, I mean, I think it helps me clarify. What I'm referring to here is, I guess, in bringing it back up to the level where we've created some shared reality. There's a theory of change, like a social transformation. We could all say, yeah, we need to transform and regenerate our society, our economy, ourselves, our neighborhoods.
We do.
Okay, then there's sort of like a how or a method conversation, in which I guess I'm pointing out that some of the ways that I perceive the methods that are being employed, I perceive as potentially like deeply counterproductive, or like and in specific, I'm talking about some speech issues, like, and safety, and safety versus freedom, and it's a complex issue, and there's like all sorts of contexts there, and mostly what I'm hungry for, which I don't think is happening in the discourse, is a nuanced conversation about the role of speech in societal transformation, and when we create what sorts of space and rules between people. Because sometimes you want to be really limited, and sometimes you want other spaces that are just like, say whatever the hell you want, like, and people may not go there because it might be super toxic and weird, and you just might not go there. And so anyway,
am I hearing? So it sounds like I'm curious, like, what is I think like the pain point for you that where the question is arising from?
Yeah. I have a story. I have a set of stories, they're like the vestiges in my long, unorthodox unlearning and learning journey as a human. I would say I started out somehow, like the cultural context I started in was probably, pretty rational, empiricist, liberal democracy, middle class, scientific, sort of like Enlightenment thinking, and so therefore there are pillars to that perspective around what makes, like, how we fix society, or there's like certain items of faith around how we progress as a civilization. And one of those pillars that I've examined and sloughed off and taken back in again, and still is somehow a part of the fabric of my worldview, I guess, centers around freedom of speech, like speech and discourse and dialogue as a fundamental, as not just a right, but it's sort of like it's one of the ways that we, as a culture, we evolve our culture to be more coherent with reality. Let's just put it that way. It's like, to me, in my brain, and there's ways in which I see the you know, like the new generation that's leading the I don't even know how to talk about this, but I perceive it strongly in the Black Lives Matter. Frankly, I perceive it strongly in the community around Lyft economy and other places, is around a very different perspective. I perceive it as a different perspective around speech that, like, in moments I react to as almost Maoist, and like almost like the Cultural Revolution in China, where they basically dragged people who didn't toe the party line out in the streets and they like got rid of them basically. And it's like, if you don't say things in a certain way, there's like an allergic reaction amongst a particular community. And I get really scared about it because the history of, for instance, Maoism is really scary. It's like, it's scary, you know. um that's, you know, just to like unveil it, that's a little bit more of the story. And I'm, you know, and I'm trying to parse that because I also want to be an, I like resonate with, and I want to be an ally with many of the other threads of this revolution. But there's this like central one which feels, you know, like the means and the ends could have a very perverse dynamic, I guess, in the culture that we're trying to create.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think to take it to Mao level might be uh
Yeah, it
that's
could be too much, and it likely is. It's likely sort of hysterical, but it's the
I see the
hystericalness that I'm
direction that you're,
responding to, kind of. It's like,
yeah, I
that's
mean,
like the fever pitch of like, ah, and it's like,
right,
ah, you know.
right. Yeah. So it sounds like what is, and maybe just to clarify a little bit more so that I'm understanding, like, what is the need that feels like, you know, that there's a concern.
Yeah, the concern is just that we won't get there, that these things I also deeply care about won't
Yeah.
come to be if we continue to be overly politically correct, and we enforce political correctness, and we don't let people talk, and we like let the hysteria of that guide the tone, the tenor, the quality, who can speak and when. That we're actually going to just like go into a cul-de-sac that'll either be just a dead end or be terrifying. That's my fear, kind of.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think there's maybe a whole space to, you know, some of the things that I'm hearing from what you're saying. That's like, um, that, right, like there's both a need for accountability, and there's also an action following from accountability, and also a need for there to be uh, candid communication. And so maybe there's like an insidious part there, that where things kind of move from out of the light into a place where they can't necessarily be addressed, um, like, and they can kind of like lurk and fester in the shadow. Um, in that scope, it's like it it does seem really helpful to be able to have conflict surface so that we can be in generative relationship with it
Mm-hmm.
and move through it. Uh, and also, you know, potentially sometimes, again, I think it's super probably context dependent. Um, and I think from what I gather, there's probably like a nuance or difference between call out culture and cancel culture. I'm not sure if I fully like have clarity on that right now, but you know, I know that there's also a difference between, it kind of ties back to the decompartmentalizing thing that I was speaking to earlier. We can, you know, push people out of our communities or push people away out and over there for someone else to deal with. And I don't necessarily think that that is the best approach. It is an approach sometimes to help, you know, reduce harm for some, and maybe not necessarily the work of folks closest to the harm or the wounds that may have been inflicted by whatever, to, you know, be in relationship with that individual. But in some way, like, community needs to not externalize, you know, or I don't know. It's difficult to speak about it, I think, in the abstract, because I'm not totally sure the context that you have in mind. But I would say that there's probably, yeah, I think I'm hearing there are some you know, people feeling like they're being silenced or something like that.
At least there's a narrative that is happening and part of what's happening. Whether or not it's true, it's very hard to parse. You know what I mean? Because it's like,
Sure.
it's all part of the swirl of our crazy social media lives.
Yeah, I agree. I will say one thing that I have observed though is like there's also, I mean, sometimes like I have observed where sometimes there's just like a, and I don't know how this will land, but like sometimes there's a white fragility dynamic where there's like pointing out, if someone, say, is like having some kind of saying something that is perceived by some as harmful in their speech, and then, you know, folks bring it to their attention, and in bringing it to their attention and saying, like, you know, you need to not be saying X, Y, and Z, you know, this is why it's harmful, or something to that effect. And then that person feeling like, oh, I'm being, you know, silenced and I need to be PC, rather than understanding, or like thinking, rather than listening, and thinking, trying to figure out how to best articulate this. But yeah, I think it's really,
I mean, I'm hearing you, and I think that
context
I mean, I resemble that remark. I mean, I think there is a cultural propensity, especially amongst, you know, like white dudes, to sort of like, you know, it's a thing, like mansplaining and white fragility, and like the impulse to sort of like modulate or mitigate to get it just right. It's a thing. My boy is just coming in right now, and I'm just noticing we're just about to come up to the hour here.
Yep.
Hey, Bryn, I can just a moment.
Sure, yeah. Fatherhood life.
Woo.
Oh, I haven't
Here you
seen
go,
this
bubs.
again in a long time. Hey, buddy.
Yeah, so that's a thing. That is totally a thing, and oftentimes I've been doing my best to err on the side of just sort of like, shut up and listen, you know, watch yourself going through this, and over the long term, maybe there are these patterns of that could be troublesome or problematic and actually get in our way, like us as a group of people working to make a better society. Maybe this is something, but just like hold on to it and observe it, and wait to bring it up later. So, you know, I resonate with that, and I think that is an important, yeah, that you're calling out something that's real and is an important kind of consideration. So
Yeah, and it again, I'm not necessarily saying wait to bring it up later. I think it's context dependent. You know, engaging in that moment might be the right thing to do. Hi, buddy. Oh, yeah. Like, I think balancing that with like an awareness that a lot of times what that process is surfacing is some type of blind spot, and just kind of, there's a term that I use called nexus blindness, which is like another way of saying a blind spot, but it's surfacing that we're actually blind to seeing the connection between two or more things. And if we have a blind spot and we don't know we have a blind spot, that's called having a blind spot. So I think that I just wanted to point that out as maybe
well, and I think that actually, like, we just I
know we're at time.
I don't want to wrap, but I want to like hold that observation. Come here, love bug. I want to hold that. You're gonna run down to mama? Okay. I want to call that I actually that the meaning making resolution there, which is that what I've been struggling with is this like nexus of blind spot of a blind spot, and that it's also what I'm wanting to do is struggle with it in such a way as to make it clear to myself and others that it exists. And my guess is amongst like my generation of like white allies, there is an important piece here around how this like pillar of our upbringing and values is strummed by the present moment and creates sort of like an emotional reactivity. And so anyway, I think that's a good place to sort of land on it. That's what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think tracking your experience with it, you know, so that you can relay that to folks who share in your, who, you know, can resonate with your journey. So anyway, this has been delightful.
It's been delightful. Thank you so much for hopping on, Andrew. And I'll pass along the link as it comes available. And yeah, blessings to you and yours. And yeah, take care, and we'll be in touch.
So great to see your beautiful children. Look forward to the next time, Gregory.
Bye.
Bye.